Walter, from what he says, it's obvious I like to talk, and I do like to talk. So today I'm going to talk to you about the book that he described, Voices of Diversity, one particular part of it, and that is, in the process I will tell you how I did this study, but the kinds of problems the families of these people from diverse backgrounds were having and how they dealt with them. That's what I'm mainly going to talk about. And I was just saying to Emily before everyone came in that I have never really explained to anybody what the front page or the cover of the book is about. It illustrates three ways you can get a diverse family. Probably the one most people are aware of and think of is the mixed race marriage, and this illustrates a marriage between a Lebanese who is pretty white-skinned and an African-American woman. Over here is another way that you get diverse families in the United States now. It's becoming more common, and that is an American couple who is just American, and they adopt children from other places, typically Central America or Mexico or the Far East. And so here's a couple that have adopted two Korean children, and I understand that they have adopted another one since this picture was taken. And down here you have a mixed religion marriage between a Jewish man who is here with his yarmulke, and they're standing under the huppah. The bride is Christian, and the marriage took place in her church, which is Christian, with a huppah and using many of the traditional Jewish wedding patterns. And so that's what I say family. That's what I think of it. This is what American family is about. All kinds of mixtures, and we've been doing it a long time. We just don't think about it because we don't think about how many of, quote, white families are mixtures. We say, oh, they're just white, but they're very different cultures. And this is the kind of thing I was interested in. Okay, so we've got multiple religions, multiple races, national origins. It's been that way since colonial times, through the Revolutionary War. In the early 19th century, we think about that as being just white, but the Protestant groups that came over at that period were extremely different. Some of them were traditional Anglicans, and others were break-offs from both the Catholic and the Anglican faith, and they were not liked very well by the other groups. There was a lot of disagreement and prejudice and that sort of thing, and they were seen as minorities. Incidentally, they were also seen as different races. Whether people want to think of it or not, you could be white and be a different race because, well, certainly the Irish, they didn't think the Irish were at all the same race as the good English Protestants that were here. Anyway, you get into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and that's when you begin to get even more differences. Irish Catholics, the Catholic part was very bad. Jews, Italians, Eastern Europeans, Mexicans, and one of the things nobody wants to remember, or a lot of people don't know, is that a lot of Mexicans became Americans not because they moved here, because we moved the border there. And so an awful lot of Mexicans who lived in Arizona, New Mexico, California, the whole southwestern part of the country, all of a sudden, when the United States took over that section of North America, they became, by virtue of changing the border, American. And in 1965, when we changed the immigration law, got rid of the quota system, we introduced even more racial, religious, and national identity when we changed that law. And looking back, I don't think most people realized how much it would change the pattern of American demography by letting in people, so many people from the Far East, from Southern Asia, like India, Pakistan, and so on, from Mexico, from all over the world, that really made us even more a diverse society than it was before. Now, with my perspective, I think, gee, is that fun? But a lot of people are very unhappy. Okay, there are two main models of diversity in a society. I'm calling them multiculturalism and assimilation. In the multicultural model, what you have, and incidentally, Canada very deliberately tries to be like this. They have, the groups are encouraged to stay pretty separate. So if you have a group, whatever it is, Korean or Asian Indian or whatever group it is here, other group here, another group here, and they stay relatively separate from each other. What another model is the assimilation model, where the groups interact and overlap with each other. You still may have some people who stay separate, like some of these people in these groups here, but you have kind of a intermingling of a lot of groups. And what I'm talking about are these people who do the intermingling. Those are the people I was interested in. To give you an example, and you people who are in my classes, you've heard me say this, I am woefully inadequate in this regard. I read something that's really great, and instead of writing it down and putting it away so I can quote it later, I forget. I don't know who said this, but about the time I was writing this book, there was an article in the newspaper about a man who was talking to a Japanese visitor to the United States. And he was trying to explain American culture and diversity to this Japanese visitor. And he was saying, you know, we have lots of different races and lots of different religions, lots of different national origins, and lots of different cultures, and we are all mixed together, and we're trying to make a good society in this way. And the Japanese visitor, I understand your distress. And he said he wasn't distressed at all. He wasn't talking about distress. He was describing this as the way America was, and he kind of liked it. And this guy, oh my God, how do you deal with this? It's easy to explain Japanese identity to a Japanese child, because practically the only people that child ever encounters are Japanese. His neighbors, his parents, his grandparents, his aunts and uncles, his everybody. And if somebody who is not part of the group goes down the street, everybody goes, whoa! But in what I'm talking about here are what kinds of things happen in these very intimate relationships, not just people who encounter diversity in their neighborhood or in the place where they work and so on, but in the house. Because that, and I said, what's it like to be? I want to talk to these people and see what it's like to be in these families. So, well, we're talking about, in part, identity formation. How do I decide who I am? How do I know who I am? When there are many groups, as there are in the United States, it's a big problem. When those groups are inside your house every day, from 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning when you get up until 10 or 11 o'clock when you go to bed, and they're there again the next day, and you live with them and are related to them, it's even harder. Who are we? What I'm going to talk about here is how do these families deal with this, and how did the parents deal with this? So what I'm trying to talk about, and it is a question that we in sociology and psychology have ignored for a very long time, is what's it like to be an assimilator? What's it like to be one of these people who is not just diverse in that he or she lives in a society with lots of kinds of people, but he's diverse right here and right here. Inside of him, his person is, or her person, is made up of 2 different religions or 2 different races or 3 or 4 or different nationalities, and how do they deal with this? Until the 1990s, the assimilator was largely ignored because he or she, the assimilator, was seen as the solution to the problem. So if you finally got that Irish Catholic to agree to become Protestant, like he should have been in the first place, or she should have been in the first place, and pretend he wasn't Irish and Catholic anymore and be like everybody else, we got rid of that problem. And if you go back to the writings of the early 20th century, politicians talked about that. Anybody can come, as long as they realize, you still hear that now, that they have to become like the rest of us and forget where they were before. The reason it came up in the 90s was because racial groups became a problem. And people began to say, well, why do these people want in? Which is a different question than why don't these people want in right away? But the issues are very similar, because interracial identity and boundaries are not that different from intercultural ones. And the intercultural ones, if you go back to the mid-19th century, were viewed that way at the time. Different white people from different religions and nationalities were viewed the same way. And so what I wanted to know was, what's it like to grow up the boundaries? I want to talk to these people. There is a little bit of biography in this, because I come from a mixed religion and a mixed nationality family. Anyway, I want to talk to the people like that. All right. How do these families operate? How do the parents who have different cultural backgrounds deal with parenting? They may come from enormously different ideas about how to parent children, and how husbands and wives should relate to each other, and how extended families should relate to the family. And how do they deal with this? How do they deal with these differences? What is the impact on their children? That's the kind of questions I was asking these people. I did what we call in sociology qualitative interviews with 30 respondents from mixed families. They got to tell me if it was mixed. I just said, I want to talk to people from mixed backgrounds. Some of them, and let them come in and tell me what made them mixed. They were roughly divided, about 2/3 of them were from southeast Michigan, some as far away as Lansing, and the others I interviewed in the Washington, D.C. area with the help of my daughter, who happens to live there. And I ended up with all ages. The youngest was 18, I think the oldest was 70. So they were raised in different eras. But the difference, and what was similar to all of them, was that their families were mixed up in some way. 10 of them were interracial, 14 were internationality, and some of those were also mixed religion. 3 were specifically mixed religion, all of them Christian Jewish, and 3 were mixed in other ways, that is by immigration or by social class or by a step-parent or something like that. Okay, what were some of the problems that these families had? I remember one of the first interviews I did was with a woman whom I called Jeanette. Her father was Catholic, Irish Catholic, and her mother was Lebanese, also Catholic, which was okay because they were the same religion. But they were a typical immigrant family with all kinds of mixtures, and she said, it was so big, so many languages, so many different views, so many foods. It was so confusing. And several of these people talked about the fact that there were these, and all these different, not just racial, but a lot of these people were talking about cultural things, like food and traditions and which festivals you celebrated and this sort of thing. It was confusing. Different races. Teresa was black and Caucasian. Her mother was white. Her father was very much similar to the background of President Obama. He was an immigrant from Africa. Sarah was different religions and nationalities. Her mother was Jewish and her father was Christian from the Greek Orthodox background. And they were from different East European nationalities. And all of them felt themselves to stand out as different in their community. They were different from everybody else. And that's hard, to be different from everybody else. So, what were the problems they encountered? First of all, who am I? And it's not, and this again is quoting Jeanette, it's not just who I am, but who we are. What's our family? Everybody else can say, well, we're Irish, or we're Polish, or we're black, or whatever. And what do we say we are? Where do we fit in this broader community, like the school, or the town, or whatever? And they are constantly asked to respond to identity questions. Personally, like, who are you? What are you anyway? I've had students in class talk about this and be mistaken and be very upset when they're mistaken for a group that they don't belong to. And so people are always asking, well, what are you anyway? And sometimes not very nicely. The census asks you what you are. And until just the 2000 census, that question did not allow you to say, I'm a bunch of things. You had to pick. School records and personal questions. I had one, the person I called Teresa said she was very annoyed that every time she got a questionnaire in school, they wanted her to put down what you were. And she wanted people to know she was mixed, and she would write down mixed, and she said every time the paper would come back and there was a great big B on the top. And she said, why can't I be what I am? I think she's got a very good question. Leslie, who was one of my respondents, was part Filipino and part Caucasian, and she talked about how at family dinners she had an aunt who was also part Caucasian and part Filipino. And she says, I got to the point where this constant battling between, well, that's the Filipino side talking, or if you weren't Filipino, you wouldn't say things like that. She says, I'm not going to Thanksgiving dinner next year. Because this constant, who are you, what are you, was really getting to her. Basically, several people reminded me that it's the community that defines your identity. The school, the neighborhood, whatever local community defined was important. Robert's a good example. He came to me as a respondent because he was ethnically different, Scottish and English, I think, which in some communities, that's a big difference. But he said, in my town, race was the issue, and if you weren't, if you were either white or black, and if you were anything else, it didn't make any difference. Sarah, who is the person who was the combination of Greek Orthodox and Jewish, said when she lived, this is an interesting one, she lived in a very small town in northern Michigan when she first came here, and she said everybody thought she was kind of exotic. And she made lots of friends and she was very comfortable. Then she moved to the city or to one of the suburbs of the Detroit area. And she said constantly, she and her family were told, why don't you go home where you belong? You don't belong here. So it depends upon what the community says and thinks is important. Derek was African American, his father was African American, and his mother was a German war bride in the Second World War. And he had fine relations with both sides of the family. He was very happy with it. He said his father had a big family, so did his mother. They were constantly visiting. And he lived in a number of military bases in the United States and abroad. And he said, we got along just fine, but he said, my cousins, who are African American, live in Louisiana, and they have a very different experience. the community has an awful lot to say about who we are and what we can do. And a lot of these communities have no place for mixed families. I told you about Teresa saying that she couldn't put down mixed. She said, every group imaginable is on the list, but there's no place to say, I'm several of these. I can't say mixed. Deanna was Black and Korean, and she said, same thing. She couldn't do that. Incidentally, she was interesting because one of the things that bothered her was she couldn't say in the Black community that she was mixed. Because if she wanted to claim to be Black and Korean, people would say, what's wrong with you? Why can't you agree that? Why can't you admit to being Black? And she didn't mind admitting, if you want to put it that way, to being Black. But she wanted to be both of what she was. A lot of times communities don't recognize the differences in the family. Karen was an interesting example. Her father was of German background, and her mother was Korean from the Korean War. She was a war bride. And while she was growing up, her parents adopted one of her cousins who was completely Caucasian. And as far as the neighborhood called them all Asians. And she said her brother, at one point, he was only probably about 5 or 6 years old at the time, screamed at the kids in the neighborhood, why don't you like us Asians? And they had a very difficult time explaining to him, well, you're really not Asian like the rest of us. It's the group that tells you what you are. Here's another interesting case, was Regina, who was of Polish parents. They were refugees after the Second World War who ended up living in Brazil, and that's where she was born. She came here in the United States when she was about 10 years old, something like that. And they specifically picked the Detroit area because they wanted her to be living in a Polish community and get to know her Polish heritage, and she did know some Polish. And this was a way they were going to introduce her to her Polish language. Guess what happened? She was turned down for entry into the Polish school because she wasn't Polish. The community decides what makes you what you are. Biologically, she was Polish, but she didn't have good enough Polish. She wasn't part of the local community. She wasn't one of us. And she was really happy they had public schools that were very helpful to her, because the Polish Catholic schools had no place for her at all. Incidentally, in our society, we tend to say racial differences are the most important and the most critical. I had one woman who was a combination of two different cultural differences, and she was a different race. She was Korean and Chinese, which is theoretically that Asian, but she said these are very different cultures. They have a long history of not getting along with each other, and she said, I think the cultural differences are far more critical than the racial ones, because and what she said was, the cultural differences define everything you do, the way you walk, the way you talk, who you relate to, how you relate to them, etc. And if you don't do the same thing everybody else does, you are in trouble. The questions of identity, it's not just who am I, but who are we, all my family. Where does the identity come from? I had a student in class, probably in the 40 years ago when I first came here. And at the time I was teaching a class, and they had to write about their ethnic background. She said, I don't have an ethnic background to write about. And she said, can I write about something else? And I said, no, you have to write about your ethnic background. And I told her she should start talking to her relatives and friends and trying to see who she was close to. I still remember the day she came in to give me her paper, and she was a very nice young lady, very polite, and she almost threw it at me. I thought she was going to hit me with it. And what is in this paper? She found out by writing this paper and talking to her relatives that she was from the German Missouri Synod Lutheran Church. Her father was from that background, her mother was from that background. Both sets of grandparents were from that background. Her parents and grandparents had met at the German Missouri Synod Lutheran Church Teenage Club. She had, I think, 3 sisters. Her oldest sister was married to somebody she met from the club, and they were living in a commune of the German Missouri Synod Church, where he was going through a seminary at the German Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, and she was dating somebody from the same group, and she had 2 younger sisters who weren't old enough to date yet. But it was really clear that she wasn't just white. She was from a very specific, small, ethno-religious group. And it really was almost too much for her to handle, to realize this was how limited her perspective was. But it's not hard for her to know what she is, because everybody she knows tells her, you are just like me, and just like your brother, and your father, and your mother, and everybody that goes back forever. But Sarah, remember, she was Jewish and Christian, she said, oh, we got lots of stuff from both sides. For instance, in the Jewish religion, the religion follows the mother. And it was her, she's the one, her mother was Jewish, and her father was Christian. But for the Christian religion, traditionally, religion is believed to follow the father. So she says that 2 sides of the family were constantly arguing about which religion she should be raised in. And she said, fortunately, her parents didn't care that much about religion, and they said, well, forget it, we're not going to have any religion. You're not going to be indoctrinated into either one. Teresa's complaining about being black or white rather than mixed. And Jeanette, one of her problems was whenever she asked her parents about this issue, her mother, who was Lebanese, would say, just say you're Irish. I don't want to talk about it, just say you're Irish. And that doesn't help her, because she knows she's not really Irish, because she looked more Lebanese than she did Irish. And in some of these families, and this is really one of the things I want to talk about, is that a lot of the families didn't know how to deal with this issue of the differences. One of the ones that did handle it well was a woman named Anita, who was half Mexican and half Puerto Rican. And she, right after she said, I'm Mexican and Puerto Rican, she said, and those are different cultures, it's not just Hispanic. And she was very firm about that. And so I asked her what it was like to live with it. Almost by accident, as I was about ready to leave, had packed up my tape recorder, I said, would your brothers and sisters answer these questions the same way you do? And she leaned back in her chair and said, oh, God, no. And so I unpacked my tape recorder and turned it back on again and let her talk. And she had, I think, 6 brothers and sisters. And they were all the way over the map. She considered herself Mexican. She had brothers and sisters who considered them Puerto Rican. She had one brother whom everybody called White Boy, who was quite light-skinned, whose Spanish language skills were very limited, and who eventually married a non-Hispanic woman. And so they all had very different perspectives, very different identities. And does this mean that they couldn't stand each other, that they didn't do anything with each other? Absolutely not. They had great understanding and acceptance of each other's background and preferences for culture. I had another respondent whose father was Irish Catholic but not practicing, and her mother was Jewish, and she had a brother and a sister. And when I asked her, and once I interviewed Anita, I asked this question, how do your brothers and sisters feel about this? And she said, well, as far as I'm concerned, I'm Jewish. I follow my Jewish grandmother. And she said she had a sister who became quite good friends with a neighbor who was Irish Catholic. And she eventually grew up to convert to Catholicism. And she had a brother who, like her parents, was not particularly religious, but as she said, he's really into this Irish thing. He's visited Ireland several times. He has learned the Gaelic language, which is an extremely difficult language to learn and not very useful because there aren't very many people that speak it. So, and these were very different cultures that these people were comfortable dealing with in their own family. So that they had what I call a remarkable ability to view these models, these cultural models, as open options. I can pick that one and you can pick that one. And we can enjoy it both. It was almost like a cafeteria. And they could see these options not as threats, but as kind of interesting differences. And actually, Anita talked about how, oh, so did Vicki, about the ones who specialized in Jewish could teach you how to cook Jewish, and the ones who specialized in Irish could teach you how to celebrate St. Patrick's Day, and everybody got along quite well with it. The relationships didn't seem to suffer. I'm not saying this is true of all these mixed families, because I'm the first to admit that I only got people who were interested and comfortable enough with this issue to sit down and talk to me about it. If they didn't like it, they probably wouldn't have. But for instance, Anita talked about how their family had a monthly brunch, and one couple would be the hosts for the brunch every month, and so one month they'd get Mexican food, and the next month they'd get Puerto Rican food, which is very different, and another month the white boy and his wife would do it, and they'd have American food, and everybody came and everybody had a good time. And one of the things I talk about is how the connections, the ties, the social connections between the siblings were far more important than the cultural differences. The cultural differences weren't important to them. When I talked to Vicki, who was from this Irish-Jewish Catholic family, I said to her, how often do you contact your siblings? And she said, oh, every day mostly. I mean, these aren't people who, well, we see them once a year at Christmas, or we make sure we call my mother on Mother's Day. These were families that, whether they were close to these, they lived in 3 different places, but they were on email all the time. Close relationships. And enjoying the different cultures, cook the Jewish foods and the corned beef and cabbage on St. Patrick's Day, and be comfortable with the fact that we are mixed culture. Derek talked about how visiting his mother's family in Germany and spending a lot of time with his father's family that was very large. He's the one who said, it was a blast, we enjoyed our times with them. Basically, what these families were doing was defining cultural differences as unimportant, as interesting options, and as not a threat. And I guess what I'm suggesting is we need to learn a lesson from them. That all these cultural and racial options that are floating around us in our society are really interesting options. And we can learn about them. It doesn't mean you have to become like them. But if you see some things that you like, you can take them. These people are showing us that it doesn't have to threaten your identity or your relationships or your morals or anything to realize that somebody else is different from you. Anita, Hispanic, Mexican, Puerto Rican, white boy, each was free to express his or her own culture. But they did have a number of things they shared out of the Hispanic culture. They all knew the Spanish language one way or the other. They all did the 12 days of Christmas celebration. Spanish or Hispanic families, almost all of them, do a lot of religious traditions like weddings and first communions and the coming of age ceremony for 15-year-old girls. And they did all those. But each did them in a little different way because Puerto Ricans did it different from Mexicans, and they both did it differently from the one who was more Americanized, and that was all okay. Sarah talked about the fact that her Christian and Jewish family tended to be pretty unified in the fact that they were all pretty much into left-wing politics. So they were more of a political family than a religious one. All right, so even for the families that have a lot of problems, like Jeanette's, there were kinds of things they found that they tied them together. Her Irish father seemed to have a lot more influence over her mother's one kind of hard-to-handle Lebanese brother. And so he was the one who was responsible for calming this guy down. They had a common Catholic religion, and the friendship between the mother's brother and her father was really kind of what brought this couple together. They stressed a lot of things in terms of going forward. What were the assets that they felt they gave to their children? Derek said he felt that being black and German gave him a broader perspective on life. I think he's right. He ended up marrying a woman from the Philippines, and he joked about the fact that his kids would be eligible for all kinds of scholarships, no matter which one they wanted to name. Vicky, again, Jewish Christian, said, people ask how to make a mixed marriage work. If religion matters to you, it won't. Since it doesn't matter to us, it's fine. And she and her Catholic sister, she said, we have to defend each other in this family because it was largely a non-religious family. But one girl was very Jewish and another girl was very Catholic. And she said, we stick together because we're religious and they're not. And so they were defending their personal commitment to religion, whatever that religion was. What I think needs to happen in these families is that the parents have a critical role. They have to talk about it. This woman who said to her kids, just say you're Irish, was not helping matters. Karen, the one whose father was German and her mother was Korean, she said, the only way her family ever dealt with it was to ignore it. Her mother would just get upset and cry. And she said her father would say, race is just like big ears. And she said, that doesn't help kids. And she's right. So if parents talk about why they married somebody from a different culture, or why they adopted children from a different culture, and how they feel about this, and make it open, these were the people who seemed to be most comfortable with it. The cafeteria approach to culture, as in Anita's family, and there was another man I interviewed who I called Jeff, that it was like you're in a great big restaurant that's got this huge bar in front of you, and you can pick all the stuff you like, and you say, I don't like that one very much. And it doesn't have to be yours. And the differences were accepted, like the hybrid in Anita's family. He's just as much a part of us as those of us who are committed to either Puerto Rican or Mexican. Okay, so the major problem I see is the parental error of ignoring it. Skin color is like the big errors. Kids will hear negative comments from the community, and they can't handle these issues on their own. And so diverse families have to help kids deal with it. That's also a lesson to non-diverse families, because your kids will go out into a diverse environment, and they have to be helped to see how to deal with the differences. The major asset I saw was discussing the differences in a positive context. Why did you bring this family together? Why did you get married? What appealed to you about someone from a different race or a culture? Why did you adopt cross-cultural children and cross-racial children? And how do we pull these things together? And to stress to kids their considerable advantage in the kind of society we have today. Derek said, my kids are eligible for all kinds of scholarships. Look how many different cultural settings they will be comfortable in. And frankly, mixed background people are much more prepared for the world we have today. The world is getting littler and littler and littler. I don't know if any of you heard Arifa Javed last week when she talked about, actually she was in part talking about one of the chapters she wrote for my book. And the immigrants today are so different from immigrants before. Because immigrants before, as Arifa says, they had a one-way ticket, they left. And they really didn't have much contact with the back home at all because of the way you traveled and communicated then. Today, and so in studying the Chaldeans, if I go to someone's house and they'll answer the telephone and they'll say, they just attacked a church in Mosul, and we'll turn on the television set and 10 minutes later it's on the news. But they knew about it first. And that's how close the world has become. And we've got to get used to it. Thank you. Go.
Wonderful. There's lots of time for questions. But I would be remiss if I didn't, after hearing a talk about race, I'll tell you about the conference this Friday on the post-racial era. In front of you, I think there are copies, and you will see that the first presentation, in fact, is by Barry Lyons on More or Less White, which has to do with something not dissimilar from what Professor Sengstock was talking about. And many of you here are sociologists, and you'll see on the program you have Heather Dillaway, who is right here, and we'll be talking about something of interest to you. And the keynoter in the first session is Eduardo Bonilla Silva, who is a very eminent sociologist. And the moderator for that session is Mr. Brinkley, Mr. Bromley, who is a sociology professor. But the whole day we'll be examining the notion of the post-racial era question mark. So if you're on campus on Friday, please feel free to come and participate in this conference. It's free, open to the public, and you will get a very excellent education on this topic. So with that, questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
I enjoyed your talk. One of the things I was thinking about was what types of people decide to have mixed-race families. And just to give you an example, I have a friend, he's white and his wife's Nigerian, and they have 2 small children. And I've known him since like 19 or 20. I've known him for a while. He was raised, his parents are Jewish, but he and his brother were raised agnostic. Now the thing that was interesting about my friend is that he had always an interest in black culture and black people. He liked rap music and black music forms, and everything linked to black culture he was interested in. I mean, he had in high school and in college a lot of black friends, and he purposefully dated black women. I mean, it wasn't just some kind of date white women or Asian women, but he just purposely dated black women. So in that situation, and then also he purposely chose to work in the city of Detroit because he had an interest in black people. So in his situation, it was something that was, he was seeking it out. Eventually he was going to marry someone black. He married someone from Nigeria, but So I was wondering, is that typical, or is it something that kind of like, well, I just saw somebody that I liked, and then we got together, and now we have a family? Or is it kind of, I'm interested, is my friend typical, or is it kind of like, yeah, saw her at a party, got together, and it worked out?
I can't answer your question from my data.
Okay.
I understand your question, and I'm also interested in it.
Okay.
However, and incidentally, there haven't been a lot of studies on mixed background people anyway,
Okay.
or cultural mixtures. And I think, as I said at the beginning, it's because we have assumed that people who came here were going to do that. And the problems were the people who stayed in their own group for the cultural group. And so we wanted to study those weird cultures and those strange people who didn't realize we were much better than they and they should come and join us. And it wasn't until about the 90s that you started to have people in social sciences looking at mixed marriages. But I wasn't interested in the mixed marriages. I was interested in what happens to their kids, that's who I, and I specifically said I wanted to study the kids. And I suspect that you're putting me on the spot here, that, and that's okay, I don't mind, that the people who pick this are the people who've already kind of gotten a clue to look at other cultures and races. And by golly, if you meet somebody from another culture or another race, you might like them. And so that's all I can answer, but that's not what my study was about. And I didn't really ask them to put themselves in their parents' place. I didn't ask them, why'd your parents get married in the first place? Or a lot of them, it was obvious. For instance, the guys who went abroad in the war and came back with a spouse from the other culture. That was easy to see. And, but I really didn't ask them that. So I don't know the answer to the question. Good question. Needs another study. Yeah?
Have there been any studies done, for example, because we've become such a very small global community,
Yeah.
okay, like you had mentioned, that we have a lot of immigrants here in the Detroit area.
Yeah.
They come, they marry
Uh-huh.
an American. And for example, I'm just going to...
Some of them?
Some of them. And I'm going to be talking only about the Middle Eastern people.
Okay.
They come, they marry an American, and it's fine when the children are young. They're put into school, public or private, whatever, it doesn't matter. Nothing religious, okay? Neither Chaldean nor Islamic, okay? And the children
Two of
become...
my favorite groups to study. Go
No,
on.
I know. But then the children are in high school, dating. I think you know where I'm going now.
Yeah, go on.
And then the father decides that, okay, this is no longer acceptable to grow up according to the American culture, whatever that may be, okay, because it's a mixed bag as far as I'm
Because
concerned.
there is no American.
Well, that's why I'm saying it's a mixed
There
bag.
are American cultures with an S at the end.
Yes. And the children rebuff this. They don't accept it. Okay? And so I wouldn't consider that a strength.
You wouldn't.
I wouldn't consider, the strength part, meaning that the children outright do not accept the Middle Eastern culture being imposed on them.
Some of them.
Mm-hmm.
You're asking me to put my other hat on, which is that I've studied the Chaldeans for 50 years and Muslims for a lot less time, but also both. And so I know what you're talking about goes on in these communities, but in many instances it doesn't, because I have talked to some parents who have also changed their picture. It doesn't happen as fast with the parents as it does with the kids. So the first generation, the kids who either come very young
Or who are
or
born
are
and
born
raised
here
Mhm.
are the ones that you're talking about. They
Correct.
grow up and they say, well, we're not going to stick with the community. And I have seen the families. I remember one Chaldean family that had 3 sons, and all 3 married American girls.
Mhm.
And of course, there was a lot of weeping and wailing in the family because
How dare they?
how dare they do that? And one of them told about how he was the youngest, how when he came home and said he was getting married to his American girlfriend, his 2 brothers took him out on the front lawn and beat him up. 'Cause how could he do this to their mother when they had done the same thing 3 and 4 and 5 years before? But this was, but I also noted that if you went to a wedding or a funeral, you saw that family with the American brides and the kids going to the weddings and going to the dinners and all the rest of that sort of thing. And many of the brides would say, and it need not be a bride, it could be a group, saying, well, we really go to my mother-in-law's house more than we do my mother's house because we know we'll have more trouble with the Chaldean relatives than my family anyway. And so many of these people get taken into the ethnic community even though they are out. I mean, at the time, there's a big battle. I've also heard parents defend their kids against the family expectation and the marriage expectation. So it's a mixed bag. It's a very mixed bag.
It seems like each family could be its own case study.
Yeah, it's, and when people say, I wish I had a quarter for every time an ethnic group person has said to me, well, you know, we are different because I have not yet seen a group that's really different. Ethnic groups are ethnic groups. I don't care what religion they are, what nationality they are, what anything. The pattern of behavior and whether they say you can marry in or you can marry out and all these kinds, the kinds of issues they have are all the same. They all want to think they're unique.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I've seen all of them occur in the communities that I've studied. And I've even heard some of the leaders talk of, well, I was interviewing somebody who was a leader in the Muslim community, and he's, you know, saying, well, you know, we're all different nationalities, and some of us are Sunni, and some of us are Shia, but we all start going to school together, and by the time they get in high school and it, pretty soon the Shia and the Sunni don't think of themselves as that different, and incidentally, that happens back there too. And the Lebanese and the Syrian and pretty soon they're doing the mixturing that everybody else does. And yes, sometimes it happens with the Christians too. I mean, and the Jews and the Christians, the Christian-Jewish marriage, intermarriage, when I started out, it was very unusual, and it happens a lot now. Anyway. So, yes and no.
Well, each one is a case study from what I've seen, because
Yeah,
not everything is the same, and it's so dynamic.
yeah. And you find the same kind of patterns in all the groups. Yes?
I was kind of curious about, in terms of her question there. You know, the perception we have is that, you know, a lot of the Middle Eastern communities are, you know, extremely patriarchal. And I wondered if in the children, I know you had very few of, you know, each of, but is that something which is really not very typical of, you know, Irish and, you know, whatever, we're sort of like, we don't have that kind of, like, you know, the patriarchism.
Now you don't so much.
Yeah. And I just wondered if you saw any of that kind of transmission of those sorts of...
In these people?
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. But it was, remember, I only have 30 families.
Right.
I only have 30 people that I'm talking about. But for instance, it brings up an interesting example to you. You remember I told you Jeanette's mother used to say, just say you're Irish? Her mother was Lebanese Catholic. Her father was Irish Catholic. And when I've given that talk to Middle Eastern people, they've said, but she was right. Because in the Middle Eastern tradition, the child takes the ethnicity and the religion of the father. And so according to this mother, she should tell her children that they should say they're Irish, because that's what a good Lebanese child would do, is claim the father's patriarchal heritage, right? And so, yeah, I did see some of it, and I think the same was true to some extent in Jeanette's family. That's another, well, that was Jeanette's family. Some of the others were like that. And so, but you're not always talking, at least mine, you're not always talking about people close to that heritage. It's been diluted a little bit. So, yeah, who knows? I mean, one of the things that fascinated me was you never know which cultural patterns they're going to pass on. It was almost like flipping a coin. And it seemed to be their personal choices, like Anita's family, that each one of the kids said, I like Dad's Puerto Rican side better than Mom's Mexican side, or maybe it was the food, I don't know what it was. Maybe they were closer to that particular person, maybe they learned the patriarchal side. It was, I don't have enough data to be able to say which factor played the biggest role, but the variations were fascinating.
I think also, the patriarchal part, traditionally in the Middle East, the man has been the breadwinner, okay? Things
Yeah.
have changed markedly,
Mhm.
okay? However, even if both husband and wife are in the United States, many times both of them are the breadwinners,
Yeah,
okay? So
and
the roles
often
have
have to
markedly,
be.
pardon?
Often have to be.
Often have to be, yes. But I mean, even if they're highly educated, both of them continue.
Yes.
Okay, even after the childbearing years and that part. However, the tradition still continues, even if the person is not highly religious, meaning Islamic in this case, that the father.
No, it's a cultural tradition,
Right.
not just a religious tradition.
Right. However, after the age of 5, the father can assume the rights to the child, okay, under Islamic law. Before the age of 5, because the child needs nurturing and whatnot, even if the mother is a professional, even if the mother is working, okay? So that's an interesting point, because I've seen that after the age of 5, the father takes on the schooling. Mathematics is wonderful in the Middle East, right? It kind of carries over here too, okay? Forget the new math, this is how we do it, okay? Because people in that part of the world excel at mathematics compared to Americans, okay? Which I think you might have heard also, okay? But it's very interesting that the father takes over, perhaps out of tradition, perhaps because of the cultural religious part after the age of 5.
It's hard to separate.
It is. It's very, very hard because one it could even be a Christian, a Chaldean living, but because of the traditional role of the man in the family, even if both are professional, husband and wife working, he takes the lead.
We had a graduate student finish her PhD last fall, and she did, the topic of her dissertation was the impact of the gender of children on the family relationships in Arabic families. And she was talking just about the kinds of things they did, like the jobs they assigned their kids and that sort of thing, but also marital satisfaction.